That was fantastic, Luke, and all the speakers. So we have about 13 or so minutes to have a conversation amongst this group. And so maybe Danielle, you could start us off. I saw you had a question there. So you want to just kind of pose it to the group and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very curious what we know collectively, we scientists know about the to what degree movement on a keyboard, let's say, or physically in a room through a physical space tracks movement across ideas or through a conceptual space. I mean, we definitely know that navigation in both conceptual and abstract spaces and physical spaces is supported by a hippocampal function. So you would imagine that there should be some correlation between the two. But I'm curious to what degree that's really been tested. And if it hasn't, whether we would imagine we might get more predictive power if we watch both movements in physical spaces and movements in conceptual spaces. I guess that's just a question to the group.
And maybe, you wanted to comment on that? I
Yeah,
mean, I
I
think
can
what we've been
comment
hearing
on
is
the
like,
keyboard aspect. Um, so working with Alex Liao on this, we've had many discussions about, you know, trying to preserve the user's privacy and confidentiality, and so we actually don't track content at all. And we really try to mask how we could possibly reverse engineer content from the distance between keys on the keyboard, because we could figure out what keys were being pressed just by calculating the inter-key distance and the inter-key delays. But what we are doing, what Alex has been very clever at, is sort of figuring out whether somebody is typing with two hands or one hand based on inter-key delays and inter-key distances, because we find that the inter-key delay, which is our measure of typing speed, is the one that's associated with some of our cognitive domains of interest.
and maybe Nick, you can also comment. I mean, one of the points you made in your talk was about just the issue of concordance across self-report and movement features, right? And I think one of the things that becomes very powerful when you do multimodal phenotyping longitudinally is that you can then look at if there is a finding of, let's say, conceptual, uh, activity that varies as a function of state, as Danielle you were suggesting. Maybe it would also vary along with other basic movement parameters or other self-reported measures. Any thoughts on that from your end?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I think there probably is some degree of concordance, but I guess, yeah, I think that the concordance to me, I guess I'm usually focused on, I guess, a utilitarian perspective of all of this thing, where we try to use movement as some kind of useful indicator or things like that, because it can actually just be done passively. The In terms of like the subjective content, like narrative flow or something along those lines of how that tracks, I would expect there to be some degree of concordance, though I'm guessing it's fairly stochastic.
I will say that, like, as a psychiatrist, one of the things you notice in an interview with somebody, right, is when you ask an uncomfortable question, one of the things that can happen is they get physically restless. They might make a gesture, or scratch their head, or move around. The other thing, though, that can happen that you're trained to pick up on is that nuanced. They just shift the conversation a little bit, right? They sort of avoid a topic, and it's that they got restless, and there's this sense that they dodged the question, but it is that sense of like it's like seems to be motivated by some kind of restlessness that either gets manifest as a physical movement, or sometimes it can just be one of these kind of conceptual shifts. But
Oh,
it's really interesting.
absolutely. Like the psychomotor retardation and the like the physical thought slowing down, like the feeling that you're like slowed down physically and mentally. I think there's certainly concordance there, and the same when like you're talking about with their fidgeting or moving around with the agitation and maybe anxiety states. I think also kind of mirror the two mirror themselves in that way.
So sort of a different perspective, which I think I'm sure Danny's aware, because it's a lot in line with her area of expertise. But it's like a really exciting time in the last few years where a lot of work that's been studying like hippocampal maps of how for spatial navigation, a lot of people have been trying to generalize this concept of how people represent information, incorporate it into other types of maps, such as like cognitive maps for just any type of cognitive space, but also social maps. So how people navigate their social networks. And it's super early days, but it's like preliminary looking like there could be some overlap. It's not clear that the same place. I mean, actually, I think it's super unlikely that the same place fields are going to map across these in neurons, but that at least parts of like the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, maybe like entorhinal cortex, are showing for social maps, cognitive maps, and spatial navigation maps. So I think it's kind of interesting if, is it just a general property of how these regions are working? And then when we're navigating these more abstract spaces, that it's just a natural thing, or if there's actually something more similar about how we think about navigating this stuff that we just haven't really understood yet. So I think it's just a really cool question and thing to think about.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm also curious about is, so maybe I'm wondering if the level of concordance differs according to the clinical group, and if we're in a very healthy group versus one that has bipolar or schizophrenia or something else. Because I mean, if they're redundant bits of information and you can get it all passively, as Nick was saying, then, of course, all we need to do is measure how people are moving. But to the degree that you start to get a little bit of different information from each of these kinds of movement, then combining them together could provide a more predictive capacity. So I think what would be also really neat is to understand when and where they start diverging, and in who or at what times. And if they're completely uncorrelated, that's maybe not so helpful. But if they're correlated but kind of diverging a bit, then it becomes more interesting to combine them.
Absolutely. And I think what's really powerful about all the methods you guys have been talking about today is just the temporal density now with which we can capture behavioral measurements and the ability to do that over multiple time scales. And I think this is what was previously not really possible or feasible. In a lot of studies, you could ask questions like that, but to actually study how context and condition affect those relationships over time, and then study the dynamics as they come in and out of a phase of illness. Let's say it's really a new opportunity to apply all these dynamical systems approaches that Olu, you were bringing up earlier, and I think was a theme throughout everybody's presentation. I want to just pose one of the questions that a number of people had upvoted. We're in pandemic times, and everybody here is doing longitudinal studies. People would like to know what changes to your studies, if any, have you made as a result of the pandemic, and particularly around items that you might have added. I mean, I guess the advantage is everybody here is doing some version of remote studies, so at least you can keep doing your work. But would be curious to hear from the group, how you're accounting for the effects of the pandemic and any significant changes that puts on your results, as well as any of those additional kind of baseline questions. Anyone want to answer that?
Yeah, well, we've actually started both of the studies I talked about today in the midst of the pandemic. So it's been an interesting way to start two fairly large studies. And we have moved a lot of our assessments to remote assessments, but we do have to bring in people for neuroimaging, right? So we do what we need to do in person when they come in for their scan. And then we've added a pandemic impact survey that just sort of tries to characterize how the pandemic has impacted their lives, whether it's impacted them socially, financially, et cetera.
Yeah, we're kind of, fortunately, we were planning most of everything I do involves some kind of technology. So fortunately, everything was planned to be remote pre-pandemic for things that are ongoing, which is very convenient. But I mean, I think in terms of like, how is it going to impact the results? So it's going to probably be pretty dramatic. What used to be a sign of function and behavioral activation, I think is now a sign of non-compliance and potential risk seeking. So it's like, the whole behavioral map changes, I think, potentially, of like where you're going and things like that. Yeah, we're also adding measures and things like that to try to measure the impact. It's got to have a major impact. But the other thing I think it's an unparalleled opportunity in the terms of like actually monitoring engagement with other folks, is because so much of this is based in technology, and a lot of that can be quantified. And so like that, in a way, it really does allow an unprecedented way to actually help measure these things, despite the terrible nature of what everyone is experiencing in the shared experience.
So unfortunately, our longitudinal studies have been suspended because they were imaging, and the imaging center shut down, and all our undergrads are gone, so we can't bring them. So that's I think a shame. But one thing I actually I find really interesting that relates to what Nick had presented about, movement and relating to mood or changes. And I have some colleagues who did a really interesting study where it was built, it was in humans, but it was building on some work that had been done on animals about entropy or diversity of experiences. And they did it on how they navigated space in their daily lives over multiple months. And so obviously most of us are stuck, especially the ones that are compliant, as Nick said. But I wonder if now we could measure diversity of experiences in a different way. So it could be from like the Wikipedia browsing patterns that Danny was talking about, or it could be like, how many different devices are you on, or what are you doing? How many websites are you tracking? And I know it's like, it gets really tricky because of like privacy stuff, not unlike anything else we've been talking about. I wonder if it's like an opportunity to study similar things, but now happening more in our minds rather than in physical space.
Totally. And this relates back to what we were talking about earlier. I mean, I've become, as we do this kind of work, really interested in just foraging. And we kind of talk about this. When you follow somebody for a long period of time, it's really hard not to see there's constant leaving of their house as these little foraging expeditions. And then just the ways that we deploy our energy, whether it's literally just browsing across Wikipedia or, engaging with a friend in what would be like a very far kind of reaching conceptual discussion. There's an energy cost to it, but there's also obviously like a benefit in what we're foraging for. It's not as simple as maybe in the old days where it was just purely metabolic foraging and things like that. But now we have other token foraging systems, that whether it's social reciprocity signals or other things that humans seem to be latching onto. And so it's fascinating for me, this things like the pandemic, other natural experiments now where everybody in these studies is getting a similar kind of change to their those kind of explore exploit dynamics and how they navigate it, whether it's depending on whether baseline conditions like schizophrenia or depression, how that really changes the calculus for them. So great. Well, maybe just in the last minute or so here, I could just quickly get from each of you guys. One of the questions was related to return of results to research participants. And I'm curious if you guys maybe in a closing comment or two could just comment on what are you returning to participants these days? How do you think about that process, given these measures in many cases are pretty experimental? Are you doing it? How are you thinking about that? Maybe just take 30 seconds or so each, and we can. Olu, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So because, as you mentioned, a lot of these measures are experimental, we're just providing basic information about their keyboard usage without much interpretation of what those keyboard metrics mean, because they have yet to be validated. But eventually, we would want it to be some information that provides some utility to the user and that would be actionable for the user.
Great. Nick?
We are, I guess depends on the study, but for some studies, we're trying to use that actually as an intervention. So this personalized feedback, knowledge is power, and some pretty large open trials showed that just giving that information from essentially the EMA and digital phenotyping paired together has noticeable changes in both behavior, physiology, and self-report, and it's been pretty promising. So really actually very interested in continuing that work.
Interesting. Luke?
So I guess our work's has a slightly different flavor, and we don't typically give much feedback back to the participants about things. We have some sort of pilot things we're working on about trying to do manipulations of interventions. So you deliver stuff back from things that we're measuring to see how it changes behavior, but it's more like an experimental manipulation. I'll say that like sharing the data alone has been more challenging than I expected when we started some of these things. So for example, one of the things we saw in our lab is pain, and especially in social interactions. And I think we've amassed one of the larger facial expression databases of pain in the lab that we were hoping to share with people. And it turns out just for privacy stuff, and without getting a really explicit consent on everything, like we had consents, can we use your data, can we show it, but not could we share your data with another person. And so this has been collected over like 5 to 7 years, and I don't know, it makes it really tricky. So we can share things like these model derived summaries of their facial expression with other people, or if the participants want to download their data, that's anonymized. But it's actually, as you start getting into the conversation stuff's been really tricky too. So there's some IRBs that don't let you share the actual voices because it's identifiable, and the videos obviously are hugely identifiable. So yeah, I think it's been a really tricky thing. In the conversation data, we found my student has mentioned that when they know we're recording versus when we're not recording, that there's like this complete shift in the conversation, especially among friends, of which they're willing to disclose, and which for obvious reasons I think you'd imagine. So just the act of actually collecting this data, I think, changes what the things we're measuring as well.
Definitely. And Danielle, what about you guys?
I guess I would just like briefly say it's a little bit more like Nick's response, which is that it depends on the study. For some studies where we actually have an intervention that we're providing people based on their previous data, then obviously they know how they've been doing. But for most other studies, we don't actually provide data back to them.
Well, once again, I just really want to thank each of you guys for just a terrific set of presentations and very thought-provoking discussion. So thanks again to each one of you. And